What's up, Ego Hackers? Welcome to the show. This is season 32, episode 5. What is the Octogram and the 4 Octogram variants of the ESFJ archetype? Pretty awesome to have the opportunity to discuss Octogram in this manner, because so many people have so many different questions about which variant or which subvariant they are, how do they act, how do they behave. Why is knowing the Octogram even necessary and knowing? And it really is, because for one, it's a whole new level of ego hacking, for one, but also because knowing somebody's nurture, where they've been in their life versus where they're going, is really important and extremely key. Necessary to really fundamentally understand somebody from a level that they haven't been understood before. So, from an Octogram perspective, it's really a big deal. It's I've come to find that it's basically everything, and at least it's everything that the Enneagram was attempting to produce. But the problem is that Enneagram mixes a lot of things. So yeah, but what is the Octogram? Octogram is the interpretation of how nurture impacts our nature. There are 4 paths of nurtural development. Whereas the Enneagram tries to combine nurture with a bit of nature, the Octogram is pure nurture separated from nature, but demonstrating how nurture shapes the expression of our nature. The Octogram reveals the 4 nuanced expressions for each type. Octogram is also our version of subtypes and details why each subtype or variant expresses themselves differently. And so how does the Octogram actually form in a person, right? Well, there's 2 things. It's environment and soft locking. And if you don't know what soft locking actually is, you can learn what that is very easily by going to the Journeyman section. I mean, if you're watching this, you're already a Journeyman member. Go into the cutting edge area, and then from a cutting edge perspective, let's see here. It's December 2022. That is the specific Octogram episode or soft locking episode to watch. But the other thing is environment, basically. So our environment forces us to prefer one side of the mind over the other. Our family, communities, and life experiences we face pressure with every day. Our brains, through neuroplasticity, adapt to our environment. However, soft locking is the engine for Octogram and nurtural development. Environment either enables or disables the expression of our ego. If you cannot express your ego fully in your environment, the pressure will lead you to other sides of your mind due to neuroplasticity. However, your psyche will always still trying to achieve its cognitive origin, even from a different side of the mind. Soft locking refines your ego, which is ego enablement, or it expands it, ego disablement, forcing expression or expansion to the other sides of the mind. Soft locking is the result of your life circumstances pushing you along the path to enlightenment. So, soft locking, basically, when you're around a person, what basically happens in a nutshell is that your functions match up to their functions, and naturally, your cognitive functions are trying to find its counterpart. The counterparts are basically, from a compatibility perspective, extroverted feeling would be looking for introverted feeling, for example. The extroverted function is seeking out the introverted function, or the introverted function is presenting itself to extroverted functions to be able to consume it, while your extroverted functions are looking to consume the introverted functions of the other person. However, as we found out with soft locking, and I'm very happy for Chris Taylor to even talk about soft locking to a point. But the issue is basically that from a soft locking point of view, the optimistic functions and the pessimistic functions have to match. So if you have an extroverted feeling child, it needs to find the next function that is optimistic. It could be introverted feeling trickster, it could be introverted feeling child, for example, introverted feeling nemesis, but it has to match a fellow optimistic function and another side of the mind. And when it does match, what it does is if it's outside of the other person's ego, it will force the other person to cognitive transition so that they can produce the optimistic other half, or the optimistic counterpart to that specific cognitive function, right? That's what it does. That's what it means ultimately. So in order to facilitate that, obviously every single person's relationships, and even their primary relationships versus their secondary relationships, put some kind of soft locking pressure onto their mind, basically. A lot of people don't even realize that that's happening. especially like when you look at, someone who's growing up in a family. Immediate family relationships are what I would call primary relationships, right? So because they are primary relationships, it means that we rely on those relationships the most when it comes to developing our nurture, and as much as they do that for themselves as well, which can be a bit problematic. It can be. It's not always. It's not always problematic, but the point is that it doesn't matter what situation you're in. I mean, like even your sexual relationships, those are primary relationships, but you're constantly soft locking each other into different sides of the mind consistently, right? And depending where in your brain, which side of the mind you are being soft locked into the most, really actually determines which of your neural pathways are being developed. That being said, though, as we're going to learn in the upcoming Ego Hacking Your Fear course, other than soft locking, which is basically how you impact the external environment of somebody else, or someone else impacts the environment, the external environment, and thus and they're a part of that external environment and how it impacts you, psychologically speaking, when you get to that point, that's where soft locking is. However, there is also an internal approach to developing your nurture over time, and that has to do with cognitive circuits. We have the gateway circuit and the guidance circuit, and these cognitive circuits, depending on how a person chooses to use them, because it has a lot to do with personal choice, a lot more than people even realize. Based on that choice, you find yourself in a situation where it's like, okay, I can live a chaotic life, I could choose to live a chaotic life, or I could choose to live an orderly life. I mean, shoot, that's kind of where I am right now with my own personal development, my own challenges that I face as a person. And honestly, like, it's becoming very, very difficult for me, I'll admit, but I'm getting through it. But the thing is that it goes back to that stupid teaching I used to have, and the stupid principle or philosophy that I used to have. And that philosophy basically was like, hey, when I get to a point in my life, it's like, oh, just because it's not my fault means it's not my responsibility, which is a very immature way of looking at it. It's not actually based on anything in truth, right? Like, not even at all. It's not even real. Because I realized that the truth is that just because something's not my fault does not necessarily mean it is my responsibility, right? So I have to utilize my cognitive circuits in an orderly way in order to get a better result for myself, instead of always relying on the external environment to enable me or disable me. When you become over-reliant on your external environment, that's when you become over-reliant on your own octagram instead of actually using what your nature has given you in order to potentially solve problems in your life, get over your fear, deal with various obstacles, etc. All those things. And that could be a huge problem. It can be a really big problem for a lot of people. It is a huge problem with me because for some reason, sometimes I can't kick the habit. I can't kick the habit of, well, if it's not my fault, then it's not my responsibility. And you know what? ESFJs, because they're introverted sensing pessimistic, like myself, because I have introverted sensing inferior, which is a pessimistic introverted sensing, they also struggle with this concept as well. Sometimes they end up asking themselves, hey, why is it my responsibility if it's not my fault? And that causes us as crusader types, especially as introverted sensing pessimistic crusader types, to basically be on an immature path and overly relying on our human nurture from relying on our octagram instead of relying on our nature, which is something that we should definitely do. So, but yeah, everyone's environment, everyone's upbringing ultimately shapes their octagram. And we're going to be discussing that at length in terms of like ESFJs, for example, within the context of this lecture. So archetype plus origin divided by soft locking equals octagram, or your nurture. ESFJs are seeking discovery. That is their cognitive origin. It's also known as exploration. They want to be able to have the freedom to explore. And some of the times that I've noticed that ESFJs get depressed the most in life is when they start to think that there's nothing left to explore, which is entirely false. There's always something to explore, especially since humanity has a tendency of dying off or getting close to extinction every now and then all of recorded history is lost, and everything, and the reset button is hit, and then everything has to be rediscovered constantly. ESFJs need to be okay with being in a consistent state of rediscovery, because without rediscovery, that means their cognitive origin would never be able to renew itself, because it ultimately is a renewable resource just by the basis that humanity isn't immortal, basically. And it's a good thing that humanity is not immortal, because humanity's own solipsism, also known as sin nature, would basically eat it alive for eternity. There's just no way that they can actually be allowed. Humanity cannot be allowed to be immortal because of our innate solipsism as a race. This is why angels are immortal, because they are idealistic. They think of others before themselves, primarily, versus humanity, who thinks about ourselves first, primarily. And because of that, the longer we live, the more corrupt we become as a result of our own solipsism. So this is one of the reasons why death is a gift. And death is another gift because it always renews cognitive origins, especially the cognitive origin of discovery. That way there's always something to discover. So ESFJs are seeking discovery, exploration, and the cutting edge for both creating and consuming novelty in physical, intellectual, sexual, creative, and social arenas. When they do not have something to explore, and they end up stagnating, and then they end up turning their life towards consumption alone instead of production. Paradigm shifts, such as moving out of your house, taking on a new lover, changing careers, or having a child, or starting over in a new city, often force paradigm shifts in your psyche, changing your cognitive focus. This means that cognitive focus is far more variable, whereas cognitive development is far more static. This is often why childhood determines cognitive development and adolescence determines your first cognitive focus. As you age and your circumstances change, your cognitive focus changes along with it. This is really, really important. I don't know why, but for some reason, a lot of the people within this community have a struggle where they don't realize that cognitive development represents where you have been, and then cognitive focus represents where you are planning on going, or where you are taking yourself, or where your environment is taking you later in your life, right? If you do actually want to get to a point where you want to change your cognitive focus, well then guess what? You're going to have to be willing to take the risk and change your environment. The problem is that introverted sensing pessimistic types like myself, ESFJs, ENTPs, we have this problem where we get comfortable in staying in an environment. And what if that environment is a bad environment? What if that environment is abusive, for example? What do we do then, right? What do we do? How do we deal with that? The problem is that oftentimes we become accustomed to negativity, to the point where sometimes it's like, negativity can be so normal in our lives that we end up thinking something is wrong if there is no adversity in front of us. So we end up becoming comfortable with adversity. So we end up staying in a rough environment, which can be a bad situation. Thing is, the opposite is also true. If you have a very enabling environment, you work hard, your ego works hard to stay in that specific environment and preserve that environment in order to facilitate your ego. Due to the innate solipsism of our race, we have this problem where we will do everything in our power to basically exert our will, or even our needs, what we want and what we need, needs versus wants, directly onto our environment and the people in it, and try to control that environment in order to get an outcome that suits our ego. I am extremely guilty of this, And again, the reason why this ends up happening is because sometimes that false belief of, well, hey, if it's not my fault, then it's not my responsibility, ends up coming back and creeping up in its own head, and just ends up turning into an absolute nightmare. It's actually a really bad situation. So based on that, I recommend staying away from that. Be willing to take responsibility even if things aren't your fault. It's one of the main lessons that my father, who is an extroverted feeling hero, actually taught me. He's like, hey, because he would actually introduce adversity into my life. He would willfully destroy my comfort zone. And I don't hate him for this. I don't. I actually am very thankful he did this. But he had this perspective of, hey, my fault, your problem. My fault, your problem. He's just trying to show me that, life is not always going to go the way that I want it to go. Life is not here to make me comfortable. Life is not here to always make me feel wanted. And I have to come up with I have to be willing to exert my own will upon my environment in order to get the result that I'm looking for. The problem is that often when I do so, it might be at the expense of fellow human beings. or the expenses of other fellow human beings might actually come at my expense. Whether or not it's my fault or not doesn't matter. It is still my responsibility to exert my nature upon my nurture and take control of the situation so that I could have a better future, or those in my life could have a better future, which is really rough and really difficult for me to admit, because it just means, for example, like as a man, for example, is written, if any man who does not take care of his family, he is denied the faith and worse than an unbeliever, for example. And the thing is that while my own family at times creates situations that are not my fault, they are still my responsibility. And that's one of the only ways that, for example, a man is able to actually be a man, is by taking responsibility for things that aren't their fault. Well, the same thing applies to women as well, but really within the confines of their own immediate family. They're responsible for their home, they're responsible for the children, they're responsible for themselves, they're responsible for ultimately preserving their beauty, basically. And then they have to take that responsibility and fulfill that responsibility on their own. It can be difficult. So anyway, it's just a roundabout way of saying, the environment shapes us, and we actually can shape our environment. The thing is that we have to be willing to just, make the conscious choice to not let these things happen to us, which is very difficult, especially for ESFJs to do, because their conscious choice is their inner trickster. It is so deep into their shadow that they're not always going to be willing to make that conscious choice, and that can be a serious problem for them. And it is on a consistent basis. So the 4 variants of the ESFJ. So let's look at ESFJs from the perspective of each of the 4 octagram variants. And there's 4 of them. The first one is subconscious development, subconscious focus, also known as SDSF. Subconscious development and subconscious focus basically means that these people have been really enabled by their environment growing up, and then they were able to preserve that enablement into their adulthood through adolescence, basically. These are the SDSF types. And then SDSF is closely related to the archetype of joy. They're very joyful people. And these are the people who are like, hey man, stop destroying my vibe, my joyful vibe, basically. And that's something that they really struggle with. Then there's the SDUF types, and this is related to the archetype of decay, where it's their job basically to decay things, testing out social norms, testing out ideas, trying to see if things actually matter, trying to see if there's any integrity or anything of value left over after decaying or being very entropic, right? Very entropic. So as a result of that, SDUF types are basically people who are really enabled in their childhood, but when they got to adulthood, they realized that their childhood enablement is not going to help them in their adulthood. So then they shift their focus more towards their shadow to gain the wisdom and the maturity that they need to actually get through adulthood, because they realize that they are actually really immature. And they kind of loathe that about themselves. They wish they weren't so immature, because that immaturity has bit them in the butt too many times in their adulthood. And that's what SDUF basically means. UDSF is the octagram that is related to the archetype of hope, basically. These are the people who are really disabled as children, but as soon as they got into adulthood, they were able to be a part of an environment or shape an environment where they were actually being enabled, where their ego is being enabled, and then they start having hope as a result. These are hope-based people, right? Which is pretty awesome that these people exist. And on paper, UDSF types statistically are the most successful out of everybody, out of all of the 4 variants. And then the final variant is UDUF, which is related to the archetype of despair. These people are despairing. Why? Well, they're despairing because as children they were entirely disabled, and then also in their adult environment they too are also disabled. This is like what looks like chronic depression to many, for example. They also have this, regardless of them being affiliative or not, they have this perspective where they have to be entirely independent, and they end up having to enable themselves because no one else enables them. And it ends up creating like this weird mental dichotomy where it's like, hey, or this mental paradigm where it's like, hey, use or be used, which is more for interest-based types that are in UDUF. But for ESFJs, for example, with their superego, which is the ENTJ superego, they believe that if they don't take charge, and then no one is going to respect their leadership, because they have to force that leadership in place, and they are going to take charge because no one else has trusted them to do it in the past, so they're just going to do it now. It's pretty rough. I know what that's like. So let's actually go a little bit deeper into what each of the individual variants actually look like, okay? So SDSF ESFJs are servile and generative, right? So, and the theme of that is by giving my effort to others, prosperity is found. So SDSF ESFJs are hyper-developed in their INTP subconscious with refined ego functions but lacking shadow development. So if you ever see those shirts, like Jay Ackley gave me a shirt that says shadow work, for example. These are the types, if you ever heard of shadow work, these are the types that actually benefit the most from shadow work because it's trying to teach them to get out of their ego because they're so in their ego that they can't let go of that ego because the enabled environment they had psychologically as a child and then their enabled environment that they have preserved or kept for themselves or brought with them, or they only choose those environments with which they are enabled when they are adults, for example. Because SDSFJs are developed into their heart temple INTP side, they search for okay, so heart temple INTP side, that basically means that the four temples, while your mind only, your four sides of mind represents one specific temple, each of the four temples are also influencing individual sides of the mind, and the INTP subconscious of the ESFJ is still influenced by the heart temple. It's where their passion lies. So because subconscious developed ESFJs are developed into their heart temple INTP side, they search for satisfaction more so than their unconscious developed counterparts. Subconscious developed ESFJs siphon in satisfaction, fulfillment, contribution, and effort in order to find discovery and exploration, to be able to explore. SDSF ESFJs will give themselves away. They let others dictate the pace and the path, and they are along for the ride. They will yoke themselves to others. They yearn for continued new shared experiences that titillate them and also facilitate additional exploration and discovery in their lives. They don't care about what they want. They really only care about what other people want, so long as serving others' desires leads to a good experience and a new thing for them to explore and being appreciated and considered. Subconscious developed, subconscious focused ESFJs are often the most hungry for appreciation and introverted feeling from other people because they're hungry for sympathy, because they are the most reliant on it of all the Octogram variants to find discovery. These ESFJs, if people aren't showing them gratitude, if they aren't being shown appreciation, then they feel like that they don't have anything new to explore. Their whole cognitive origin of discovery and exploration is entirely based on whether or not someone else appreciates them and trying to find new sources of appreciation, new sources of gratitude, basically. So they achieve discovery by looking for others to create exploration for them. And in return, the ESFJ will put all their effort into supporting that person or that cause with everything that they have, basically, which is really fascinating, because they are the most enabled. They're cognitive projecting that onto other people, and then they become the most enabling to other people, basically. And so it's like, hey, I want you to bring my origin. So in exchange for my origin, I'm going to be as supportive to you as possible because I can trust you to help me explore new things and discover new things. And because you're leading me and taking me in that direction in my life, I'm going to be there and as supportive as you can and be part of your support structure in order for you to keep taking me on this ride, basically. That's ultimately what an SDSF ESFJ looks like. And that's where their joy is. They end up getting a ton of joy as a result of that. They feel so joyful supporting others and then being rewarded for that support. And that reward is ultimately their cognitive origin of discovery. It's like, hey, I've supported you so long, I've done this, I've done that, and then all of a sudden for you to randomly take me across the country on a new random adventure and go on an adventure with you and explore, they just love it. They think it's the greatest thing in the world, right? Not unlike my grandmother. Definitely not unlike my grandmother. Now, SDUF ESFJs, which is servility plus gluttony, for example, serving others permits me to consume my fill. So SDUF ESFJs were enabled in their early environment, like their childhood, to use their ego, but later in adolescence or adulthood realize, usually seeing their immaturity, that the rest of the world didn't enable them the way their early environment did. Servile and gluttonous ESFJs use their contributions to provide justification for themselves, justification for consumption. And it's kind of like where they're covert contracting. It's like, hey, I scratched your back, so you're going to scratch mine. And they don't have as much faith in the other person as an SDSF ESFJ. And they don't have as much trust in the other person either because it's like, hey, I need a guarantee. I need a guarantee that if I do these nice things for you, that you will reward me. Whereas the SDSF just kind of knows that the reward will come because they're working on that. But the reality of the situation is that SDUF ESFJs, they have an expectation. And if that expectation is not being met, then they're not really going to make it. That sucks. And that can be quite painful for them. So, servile and gluttonous ESFJs use their contributions to justify their consumption. They're often extremely giving and helping, but no longer find enough discovery in just contributing to others. So they turn to exploring consumption to catalyze even more discovery. SDUF ESFJs often have a covert contract with their consumption. So long as I do my part in helpful, I am justified in consuming what I please. It is a barter of service for others for consumption for self. Consumption is also a way doormat ESFJs cope with being abused or trampled on, or cope with flat-out boredom. Consumption brings a feeling of new excitement when the environment is no longer stimulating to them. They kind of like move on from environment to environment, kind of like a virus, because that consumption is there. And they feel like they deserve it. They feel like they deserve to consume. Even if they've never talked to their partner about it, even if they've never, like SDUF ESFJs are like the people like will randomly pick up a drug habit, for example, or some kind of, or abuse alcohol, or abuse drugs, or abuse illicit sex because they believe they deserve it because they have served the greater good in some kind of capacity, right? Which is not exactly the most healthiest mindset out there. For SDUF ESFJs, consumption becomes a way of artistic expression, often consuming and sharing food, travels, experiences that have an aesthetic flavor to them. Consumption is an art to them. This is why SDUF ESFJs oftentimes are very obese. That can be a huge problem, and they really struggle with taking care of themselves because from their perspective, they believe or they think that they actually deserve that. They deserve to not have to take care of themselves because from their perspective, the consequences of consuming so much be damned. Basically, they are entitled to that consumption because they have served either a person or their lover or maybe a company that they're working for, maybe a church, maybe a community. It's just so interesting to just kind of see how that introverted feeling nemesis from their ISFP shadow ends up coming out where they feel like they deserve to consume. And the thing is that they like to consume art. So like consumable art, like a drink or a meal of some kind that would never actually exist ever again. And it's all about decay. Why is it about decay? Because all that goodwill, all that enablement that they developed as a child within their subconscious development, they want to have the opportunity to, it's like they're spending that energy. It's like they're spending their stored up joy from their childhood on themselves in their adulthood instead of actually focusing on sharing it with other people, instead of actually enabling other people. And it's like a half enablement where it's like, hey, I enable you, so you better enable me. And when you enable me, that means you have no choice but to allow me to consume whatever I want, because I gave you a choice. And by serving you, so you get to serve me by allowing me to make whatever choice I want, even if that anti-trickster choice actually harms me or creates bad circumstances for me or bad circumstances for you, that would mean that you would actually have to clean that mess up in my life. And it can be problematic. However, the good thing about SDUF types, or at least ESFJs, is that because of that, if the other person has a compatible octagram, they can actually benefit from that consumption because maybe they're stuck in their comfort zone, and this ESFJ, the SDUF ESFJ, is consistently actually getting out of their comfort zone and they use their comfort zone as like a little base, and then it's like home base, but then they go explore other things, and sometimes they take people along with them along the way, but then at the same time they will not allow other people to inhibit them from going and exploring on their own. They're a little bit more independent as a result. Now, UDSF ESFJs, which is hedonism and generativity, and the theme of that is, by pursuing my curiosities, others benefit from what I find and create. This is the hope variant. This is the hope variant of ESFJs, which is pretty awesome. That they are so hopeful. Because it's like, hey, I'm going to go do this thing for myself. I'm going to enable myself, but because I've enabled myself, because I have explored, I'm going to share those things that I've explored with you. I'm going to make you a better life because I made myself a better life because I explored these things. And I created systems. Let's think about ESFJs. They are systematic. So they will literally design procedures that they follow in their life to always give themselves their cognitive origin of discovery. And then they will share those procedures with other people if those other people would like to explore those things with them. And those ESFJs are inviting those other people to come explore with them. Or at least, hey, I explored this amazing thing. Do these things and you will get the same result, basically. That's the UDSF expression of an ESFJ. That helps other people have a better future and also basically increases the quality of life for other people because they are so generative. They're like very hedonistic towards themselves, exploring life, doing all of the things independently, and then they figure out, okay, yeah, this thing was a good thing to explore, this thing was a bad thing to explore, I'm not going to pay attention to that anymore, but then this, I'm going to design systems and procedures around this really good thing, and then I'm going to share that with other people so that they can have a similar outcome. It's marvelous. It's absolutely amazing. Honestly, I wish I personally was a little bit more like that. And this is one of the reasons why I learned so much from ESFJs as my conflict type, because this is an area in my life that they can be an example to me so that I can do something similar, so that I can actually promote the well-being of other human beings instead of just spending all of that on myself and trying to enable myself entirely, which ends up becoming a big problem later, right? So, UDSF ESFJs developed into their ISFP side into their childhood, often leading with their performance and more artisan side due to their ego not being welcome. So basically, let's say that you had an ENFJ parent and you had extroverted feeling hero and you were not really allowed to be supportive. You were not really shown gratitude or appreciation from your parents, and what your parents were actually looking for, or maybe even your siblings, were looking for you to be a source of introverted feeling for them or a source of creativity for them. So then you adapted to that environment, and then you got to a point where you were, doing what you felt was necessary to do, and were creating for them in order to make them happy, basically. Because ESFJs, at the end of the day, are still technically, let's be honest, one of the people pleaser types. So by being pleasing to these other people, it ended up creating that outcome. It ended up creating they ended up creating for the sake of other people, right? And that ends up being one of the things that they end up facing in their lives. So later in adolescence or adulthood, they found environments that supported their egos, and they shifted their focus to developing their INTP intellectual and inventive side. Basically, inventing new ways for them to be creative, inventing new ways for them to consume a certain thing or discover a certain thing, and then they would share that with other people. In order to siphon in discovery, unconscious developed ESFJs learn to lead with their purpose, which is tangible goals and pursuing some specific achievements and or expressing themselves in artistic ways. In order to obtain discovery, finding a purpose may look like subconscious developed, may look like servility, but it's just the unconscious developed, subconscious focused attaching themselves to something that can generate discovery and satisfy their curiosity. UDSF ESFJs are insanely curious. And they're going to go out of their way to explore all their curiosities. And then they will identify a good curiosity versus a bad curiosity, and then develop systems from which they can repeat those, exploring those good curiosities, and then bringing those good curiosities to other people who have a shared curiosity, basically. And this is how UDSF ESFJs actually form relationships, albeit healthy relationships with other people, through shared curiosity. UDSF ESFJs may often join the military, for example, but not so much to be servile, but because there's an inherent curiosity that's driving them to explore that experience. Unconscious developed ESFJs lead with their curiosity and the things that bring them pleasure, not always physical pleasure, to feel alive and ultimately satisfied. Unconscious developed, subconscious focused ESFJs have a direct line between things they consume and the things they produce. UDSF gluttony types are the most efficient at transmuting consumption into production. Hedonism's secret tool is teaching the skill of how following your curiosity and pursuing what brings you pleasure can actually generate more for everyone else. As you learn to explore your curiosities, as you learn to be on this consistent journey of renewing, gaining additional curiosities after you've explored them, and then as you're moving forward in your life, exploring new curiosities, the ones that you have explored, you end up sharing those with other people while you are ultimately enabling yourself to find more. And it just creates this generated system where, oh, hey, here I am, here's the new curiosities, here's the old curiosities, and then you're like filtering out curiosities and then separating them between good and bad from an ethical perspective for the FE hero, and then sharing them through your introverted sensing parent basically with people based on what you have explored. But you are always on that path to exploring. And this actually allows ESFJs in a lot of ways to lead other people through their curiosity and to produce really good results for other people because they've satisfied their curiosity, because they end up discovering principles behind success, discovering amazing experiences, discovering art. They end up discovering what really is beautiful about the world, what is really beautiful about life. And then they bring it to other people. All the while they continue to have hope that they'll be able to find even more beauty in life. That's why they're just absolutely fantastic in that regard. And I really, really enjoy UDSF, ESFJs for that purpose. Now let's talk about UDUF, which is hedonism, gluttony. And the theme of that is, I will create my own discovery by consuming what brings me pleasure. UDUF ESFJs were completely disabled in their early environment. They were likely unappreciated, unwanted, and not being given the space to speak nor appreciated for their contributions or their effort, basically. They were basically neglected and ignored. They doubled down in their ISFP shadow, even pulling from their ENTJ superego, and a double helping of purpose to survive. Being a source of desire and appreciation was the only way to survive. UDUF ESFJs tend to use their extroverted thinking demon in polarizing ways to force people to listen to them. Through extreme humor or taking away other people's voices in unique ways, often through humor, their TI inferior can still be protected. No one listens to them growing up, and their inferior was likely consistently ignored, possibly violated in their environment. These are the ESFJs who've been told that they're stupid their whole life. And then as a result of that, they had to work hard to prove to themselves that they were not actually stupid. But the only way that they are actually able to prove to themselves that they're not stupid is because they have to prove to everybody else that they're not stupid. These ESFJs are the ESFJs who always have something to prove. Always. And they never let go of it. It's consistent. UDUF ESFJs lead more with their values and desires than other variants. They also may be more career-oriented than other variants, as the status sought from their ENTJ superego is a deeper drive than other variants. Their ego, being a caregiver and supporter, is likely a forgotten dream for UDUF variants. But with the right people in their lives, it's possible for that ego to be healed and expand. But until then, UDUF ESFJs will find little rest in their ego. That's pretty rough. That is absolutely ridiculous. A forgotten dream. The thing is about when it comes to being UDUF is a temporary mind state. It is where your brain goes when it is in survival mode. And to get back into thrival mode, which is UDSF, an ESFJ who is UDUF will have to learn from UDSF variants to actually get themselves out of the despair that they feel in their lives in order to get back on the hope train, which means they have to give themselves permission to be selfish in satisfying their curiosity and exploring their curiosity, but then also sharing that and giving that to other people instead of spending it entirely on themselves, right? The problem is that as they spend it on themselves, they end up being these people who force other people. Why? Because people throughout their life have actually inhibited them from exploring, have inhibited them from discovery, have inhibited them from seeking out their curiosities. So what they end up having to do In order to protect their ability to reach their cognitive origin, they have to subjugate and control other people through their ENTJ superego. And through having power and authority as a result of getting into their ENTJ superego, they become very subjugating and controlling of other people. These are the ESFJs who are the slave drivers, basically. Very slow at slave driving. They use their covert contracts, but not for the benefit of others, but only benefit for themselves, because from their perspective, it's a dog-eat-dog world. I need to support and enable myself because no one else has, and I don't trust anyone else to enable and support myself with what I'm looking for in my life. What a really sad state of being. And that's why they struggle with depression. They struggle with depression because from their perspective, no one is around to help them. There never has been anyone around to actually help them. And that's really sad. It's really sad that they've gotten to that point. It's really sad that that's who they've had to be in order to actually facilitate them getting what they want from life, which is more discovery, which is the ability to explore. Because from their perspective, if I don't control other people, even though I'll make it look like it's for their benefit, it's really for my benefit, so that I will always have the freedom and the space to be able to discover, to be able to seek out and go after my curiosities. And once I go after my curiosities, I don't care about sharing that with other people. I don't care about making those systems, those procedures to help other people explore along the way. I don't care, because from their perspective, no one has cared enough about them. No one has been there to support them on that journey. They've had to be there for everyone else. They've had to sacrifice themselves for everybody else and everyone else's origin. They have to consistently give up their own origin for others in their lives. And this is why these types end up becoming insanely controlling and subjugating other people, almost like they're slave drivers. It's really sad. And remember, UDUF people, they can't get out of UDUF by themselves. They need someone else in their life to enable them. And through enabling, they can actually end up reaching healing. And that healing is exemplified when they're able to transform themselves from UDUF into a UDSF variant. Because as their environment changes, they might all of a sudden, instead of being entirely disabled, they might go into a new environment with new people where they are enabled, where they are accepted, where they are given the opportunity to explore their curiosities, and people will actually help them do it along the way instead of them having to do it themselves, which will then allow them to give up control, which is absolutely important. It's really necessary, because UDUF is not a sustainable mind state. It's not a sustainable nurture for anyone to have. And if they're in UDUF for too long, it actually can lead to a psychotic break, which is really horrible. And that basically is where they get to the point where they actually look at themselves and they start believing what everyone has told them their whole life. I am stupid. And then if I'm stupid, then I have nothing left to live for. And then they just give up. And then they become very self-destructive and very destructive towards other people. They become entirely disabling to everyone in their environment. I know that's true because I've often done that myself. I am guilty of that. So please, ESFJs, if you're watching that, don't follow that path. Don't do what I have done. Do the opposite. Get the losers out of your life. There's this book called Not a Life Coach. Get the deadwood out of your life. The deadwood is everything. Get rid of the deadwood. Because those people who have been disabling you your whole life, as you get comfortable with the abuse in your life, you should not be comfortable with that. You should change the environment so that you're in an environment where you are no longer being disabled, but actually being enabled. So you can be UDSF, so you can actually have hope in your life. So let's discuss social engineering or ego hacking of an octagram. If cognitive origin never changes, regardless of development and focus, then giving a person their cognitive origin through their preferred poles is the best way to reach them. So subconscious developed ESFJs, also known as the servility pole, is best responded to by accepting the ESFJ's help and showering them with appreciation and gratitude and proving it to them, and letting them create exploration with you or help them consume their favorite things, depending on their cognitive focus. For hedonistic ESFJs, also known as the unconscious developed pole, this is best met by helping the ESFJ find their freedom and follow the path of their curiosity. Share what you want for them so their trickster doesn't cause them damage. Let them spark interest in you by the things they find interesting, asking them questions and exploring with them. So Both of the four sides of the mind and the octagram are ultimately dynamic, but the octagram is even more so because it deals exclusively with nurture. The deeper implication of the octagram variant is to understand how the other temple origins are siphoned through their poles. And to know how that works specifically, make sure you guys have the Ego Hacking by Text Masterclass. EgoHackingByText.com, get the course, and then you'll be able to upgrade into Masterclass from there and learn about how those cognitive origins are ultimately produced and consumed, and also what their love language is. And specifically, the love language of the ESFJ is touch. They love being touched, but when they are enabled, they're able to cognitive transition into their subconscious, which is their INTP subconscious, and then they themselves become a source of touch, right? Because they want to touch everything. It's like when they are entirely enabled to even explore another person's body, right? And that is everything to them. So why UD-UF ESFJs have a hard time connecting with people. And I've noticed something about UD-UF people. They have such a hard time connecting with people, and I'm one of them. I have a really hard time connecting with people. They have such a hard time connecting with other people that they really can only connect with fellow UD-UF subvariants of the octagram. And this is literally where trauma bonds come from. They're only able to truly connect with other people who have trauma, just like they do. And then they actually work with each other to help bring each other out of that trauma. And that's ultimately why trauma bonds exist. If you want to learn more about trauma bonds, please read the book titled Attached. And then you'll be able to learn. So anyway, folks, thanks for watching and listening to this episode. It means a lot to me. It's okay. And as we work really hard on our shared vision of bringing back the mature masculine, bringing back the mature feminine, and ultimately being examples of what that is to other people in order to stop fatherlessness. And ESFJs, as my conflict type, I would like to extend special thanks to you folks for continuing to challenge me. And because you challenge me, I'm able to actually get closer to my living virtue of compassion, because let's be honest, I'm not a very compassionate person, something that I regret. So anyway, folks, thank you all for everything, and I'll see you guys in the next episode.